Hello and welcome to the Inner Core. My name is Paul Rauschenbusch. I'm the Associate Dean of Religious Life in the Chapel at Princeton University. The Inner Core is a program about religion, spirituality, and ethics, and anything else that comes to mind. So welcome. We're glad you're joining us. I am delighted to welcome Dean Allison Bowden. Reverend Dr. Bowden, welcome to the Inner Core. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you.
Dean Bowden has just come to Princeton University. Well, I guess it's 8 months ago, in August of 2007. She is now the Dean of the Chapel and of Religious Life, and a wonderful colleague that I can say to our office and to the Princeton University community. Reverend Dr. Bowden, welcome. We're so glad to have you on the Inner Core. Dr. Bowden has recently completed and released a book called Women's Rights and Religious Practice: Claims in Conflict. And that's what we really want to talk about today. Allison, maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about the history of human rights. And then human rights seems like such a sort of time immemorial concept. You know, we've always had our human rights, but in fact, it hasn't always been there. It's a fairly recent understanding of, and maybe you can just give us a little timeline on what human rights means.
Well, human rights is going to mean many different things to many people, and a history of human rights, for some people, it's going to start thousands of years ago, and for many people, it's going to start in the Enlightenment. Think of the Bill of Rights here in the United States. Think of the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. So these are 17th, 18th century kinds of ideas. The idea of human rights certainly hit a whole new stride in 1948 with the founding of the United Nations and the Charter of the United Nations and the publishing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's also out of the United Nations, something that had great support from Eleanor Roosevelt. Some people will say, as I began, that human rights are thousands of years old. They'll say human rights are ideas and concepts embedded in religious traditions, in cultures, in ethical traditions, and only recently have we decided to call it specifically human rights, to make human rights law out of it. This is the world, particularly the legal world, catching up with where religious and cultural concepts have been for a very long time.
So human rights, is that essentially a personal construct? Is that something like, I have these rights? I have, you know, even in our own Constitution, we have certain inalienable rights, and I have them as individuals. Now, you know, I can imagine, and I think this might be part of the question, is like, how do my rights, when somehow they come into conflict with your rights, how do those things go together? Even before or maybe in connection with our conversation about religion, how do those things go together?
Right. Well, again, there are a variety of perspectives on this. Are rights individual, and do rights require duties from others? If I have a right to X, do you have a duty to fulfill that for me? Are rights only individual, or are rights really more appropriately for whole peoples? Are they for cultures? Are they for groups? Some coming from East Asian societies have said this emphasis in the West on individualism infects your idea of the understanding of rights. Of course, rights exist, but they are for groups, and people have responsibilities to others before they have personal rights. Your first thing is a responsibility to fulfill your rights to your people, to your culture, to your family, to your government. Incidentally, you also have human rights, but these are only fulfilled to the extent that other people understand their own primary obligations first. So stop thinking about yourself as a person with rights. Start thinking about yourself as a part of a whole society, all of these people having responsibilities to one another, and those are most important.
It's interesting, and you can see that's a very persuasive argument, but you can also see how that could be abused. Right. You know, yes, you know, we care about you, but you have to subsume your interest, your personal interest. Why are you putting your interest above the community's interest? This is your role. You stick to your role. And I can imagine that when you're looking especially at women's rights, that can be a point of conflict. Because
Absolutely.
if you're talking about human rights for women and some of, I think, religious understanding of duties of women,
Sure.
that could be a point of conflict.
Oh, completely. One of the things that the intersection of religion and rights really complicates is the idea of basic human equality. And I think for that reason, that religion is maybe the largest challenge to the idea of human rights as it is currently encapsulated in human rights law, both out of the United Nations and also other international bodies and domestic bodies. I think the religions would say that all people have a spiritual equality, or maybe only certain members, only all members of their religious community. But after this umbrella level of equality come different types of people. And those types of people are going to require different levels of rights. Gender, absolutely. And some real biological determinism comes in here. Women bear children. Well, around that fact comes a whole set of rights and obligations and duties, primarily to the family, that have to be primary. Another category of difference would be religious believers versus non-believers, non-members of the community. In some religious traditions, ideas of caste and of social location make certain people very different in terms of the understanding of human equality. Spiritually, absolutely, we all have equality. Other things like sexual orientation are used as a category by which some people, for religious reasons, need to have a certain level or kinds of rights or be excluded from others. And also, of course, certain obligations and duties first.
Tell me, maybe I think you do a few case studies in this book, or at least grounded in a few different communities. Can you give us a few examples of places where this has been in conflict, and perhaps how your own thinking in discussing this may have evolved, expanded, taken surprising directions? I mean, I think once you get into a place, it's easy to be abstract, human right, but once you get into a situation, it complicates it, you see things. How did that happen for you?
Absolutely. Well, my book looks at Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, particularly in the South Asian context. As for a case study, I could talk about certain religious communities' requirements that women practice purdah, and that means different things in different societies. For some, it might mean that a woman covers certain parts of her bodies always when she is in public, and that might be everything but the face and hands. It might include face and hands too. For some others, it might mean being basically restricted to the home. If not all of the time, then the only exception being in public in the company of a close male relative as chaperone. Some women within the Muslim community and without will say this is a human rights violation. I mean, this is a restriction on an essential human right to freedom, particularly freedom of movement. These women are not free to move around, particularly those who are required by their religious community to remain in their homes and only go outside perhaps with a chaperone. There are other women in these same religious communities who say this is no human rights infringement at all. This is an honor and a privilege. This is me really acting out what I think is at the heart of what I understand to be appropriate for me. This is an act of faith for me. I will open the Quran now and I will show you where there are texts that say that the righteous woman is a very modest woman and pulls her garment closely around her. This is me doing that, and if I am, in my house all the time, this is just an even greater observance of what's crucial to me. Other women will say, you think it is freedom to, go out and work? This is a sign of my economic status. I don't have to work. It is middle and lower class women who do not get to observe purdah in this way, and I am really, really thankful that that is not me. And there are other women who will say, I don't think this is religiously required of me, but I also realize I'm a practical person, that I don't have alternatives right now that wouldn't compromise my physical safety. So there are many different kinds of things at play. Power considerations within religious communities and particularly within families. There is very much an economic consideration going on, and women just being very practical. But it's been very interesting to me in researching this book and seeing how there are very many sides within specific religious communities. Some people think this is absolutely valid, some people don't, others are everywhere in between, and it's just fascinating as a reader and an interviewer to be taken into other communities' deep conversations about what all of this kind of thing means.
How did you get interested in human rights? Was there a moment, did you have an experience, or was it even growing up as a woman in American society? I mean, what drew you to this topic?
Right. I have been interested in religion for a very long time, of course, and I'm a seminary graduate, all that kind of thing. I'm interested in women's issues, just generally. I did not my book is published in a series of gender studies, the York University Studies on Women and Men, and I somewhat chuckle to myself to find that I'm a women's studies person. I hadn't known that about myself. I'm just interested in women. Okay.
And presto, you're a women's studies.
I am, because I'm interested in women, and that's fine. And the human rights idea came in to sort of complete the three-pointed set of interests. Really about 10 or 12 years ago, I began to think of human rights. I've always been concerned with social justice and the intersection of social justice and religion. And human rights began to just appear to me to be, as I like to put it, humanity's current best tool for securing social justice. Not the only one, but the whole point of human rights and the reason they've been articulated so intentionally in an international and intercultural way, and we can argue about whether or not that's worked, but that has been the intention certainly in the 20th century and now 21st, is to see through the rubric of human rights if there aren't certain levels of social justice that we can ensure for every last person simply because they are human. What is the source of human rights? Some people say human dignity. Many people in religious traditions, and let me add that no religious tradition is monolithic. I mean, there are just hundreds, thousands, infinite viewpoints within them. We can't just say religion X says Y. But within all of these groups is an attempt to try to get down to something that's so fundamental and that we just have to safeguard. I'm thinking broadly in terms of social justice criteria. Others may say human dignity. There are certain things we do to safeguard others' human dignity. And I became interested in the way human rights language and human rights talk actually has kind of a lot in common with religious talk. And when we begin to speak about the human being and human dignity, people with a religious identification quickly find themselves talking about concepts that have an element of the sacred to them. I appreciate particularly the idea of human rights because it is meant to get around culture and particularly around religion, to find those common denominators, hopefully not the lowest common denominator that's just an ethical washout and doesn't mean anything, but to find a common denominator where we can all talk, where we don't find ourselves divided by religion or culture anymore because we've got down to something so essential. And what human rights lawmaking keeps coming back to is the human being, human dignity, the essence of the human. And I am fascinated by the way that even at that elemental point, the religions come in and, like in the Tower of Babel, confuse our speech. We have very different understandings of what we mean about inherent human dignity when we bring in our, I mean, in my sense, particularly religious understandings, but others can say ethical, cultural as well.
Well, I think and so we have these, the claims in conflict, and I think especially women's equality movements, what human dignity means, and that can be in conflict with religious communities, especially when we go into cultures that don't have the same history that America does or Europe does. I mean, it's a very different sort of context. So I think it must be. Is this a process? Do you feel like there's movement? Is the UN and those people interested in human rights? Are they beginning to have basic assumptions changed over the last 50 years? I guess, or what, we're 60 years now since, I mean, what has changed and what has remained essential? I mean, you know, it does seem like there's a certain pragmatic element behind this. Basically, we want to make sure that every human being has a dignified life. And we want to do that in tangible, concrete ways, but the question is how?
Absolutely.
And how does it differ in a village in South Asia, in India, to a city in Kenya, to Trenton?
Sure.
I mean, it seems like somehow that kind of cultural fluency, maybe religious fluency as well, has that been a factor?
You know, it's interesting that the human rights idea is a concept that continues to evolve.
It does.
It is not ossified at all, and this is just fascinating to watch. I mean, in just the last 60 years, as you've said, out comes a wonderful, perfect on paper, perfect set of documents enshrining human rights, and infinite numbers of countries sign and ratify them and say, yes, we will abide by them. They are all a part of the drafting. This is great. I was talking recently with a friend who's in law school, and she was noting that lawyers look at human rights law and they say it's on paper, it's good, it's there. On the ground, this oftentimes, I mean, it just does not trickle down. It's not the question right now that human rights laws aren't adequate. They're beautiful. And oftentimes, particularly when religion is involved, it's not enforcement. Or enforcement is the case, but enforcement, it's the problem, but it is not the answer. You, Paul, must abide by the rights that your country has signed on to, and you need to do it at home. Now, I know how you like to treat your female relatives, but it says right here, and we signed it. This isn't going to work.
Right.
When rights came out, there was, sort of in 1948, some general understandings, but they've been complicated. One of the biggest challenges to date has been related to cultural relativism. I like to talk also about religious relativism. But this is where, for lack of a better term, non-Western countries really formally challenged at the highest levels and the lowest too the conversation on human rights and said, you know what, this really is the way you have framed it, a very Western concept, and it's coming out of your enlightenment. It's not that we're not enlightened, we've just had a different history. It's not that we don't believe in or understand human rights, we articulate them very differently, and you need not to be so sort of ethically imperialist that you can't work with us to open up again the canon, if you will, of rights and the way we talk about it, and to incorporate our perspectives. Some folks said in response, but you know what? You, in your father's generation, mother's generation, were at the table when this was drafted. And a response back is, well, yes, we had people at the table, but they were Oxford educated, and they didn't represent the rank and file people in my culture. I don't think, some do, that the question of cultural relativism has been solved. It continues to be a very live issue. I'm glad. I mean, you know, as many genuine voices as possible to help shape this. This concept is important. It doesn't mean it's always going to be the smoothest conversation, but I think it's the one that's most genuine. Another big question that came up, particularly starting in the 70s, women's movement, but in the 80s and into the 90s, was a movement called Women's Rights Are Human Rights. And so now looking from a gendered perspective and saying torture, what does torture mean? It can't just mean torture at the hands of the state. Women whose lives are mostly held in the private sphere rather than the public one are never going to be taken in for state torture because they aren't actors on the political and social scene. They may be beaten eventually to death by a man in their home or subjected to what we consider torturous behavior or imprisonment. You know, unlawful, unasked for imprisonment is an abuse of a human right. But what of certain, you know, abusive families in any religious background and location who really confine women to their home? So they're trying to take the criteria that were already well established in human rights and saying, we need to look again at what is torture, we need to look at imprisonment, we need to look at all sorts of issues related to human dignity. And then we need to take in other things that are also articulated as human rights, but make them more central. Rights within marriage. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women of 1979 has Article 16, which talks quite a lot about the rights of women in the family and in marriage. And reservations or formal protests against this article are the most numerous from countries from every region of the world. It tries to enshrine for women certain rights within the home, to citizenship, to the number and spacing of their children. Well, that makes people opposed to abortion very, very worried, or to family planning anyway. If children are a gift of God and they come when God sends them, you know, this is a big problem. So,
interesting.
So that was a more recent one. And I think that the question purely of religion in conflict with human rights is a new avenue as we talk about changes and the new big dialogues in human rights. But I may be projecting because it's what interests me.
Yeah, right.
And I think it needs to be more important, not problematized. You know, not post 9/11. Oh my gosh, religion is the problem. How do we get these religious actors off the stage?
Right.
We have this great thing going. Come on, let's get them out of there,
right.
or just belittle their arguments so much. I don't think that's going to happen. What I really do hope is that books like this and other actors come in to help religion and rights be reconciled in a positive way. I don't think that's impossible at all.
Right. We're talking to the Reverend Dr. Allison Bowden. She has written a book called Women's Rights and Religious Practice, Claims in Conflict. This is available at Labyrinth Books, also on Amazon, so I encourage you to check it out. I think that in fact we there is real tension here.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, I think, you know, especially when you get to the UN, and much of the UN's you know, core bases, European, the anti-death penalty,
right.
even beyond women's issues. Like,
sure.
what do we do with the death penalty?
Right.
That is, for some people, that's a clear violation of human rights. For others, that is mandated within religious text.
Right.
And you know, I think it's an ongoing conversation, and I'm not sure where authority places.
Sure.
You know, who has the authority to say to anyone,
right.
you know, aside from this is a good idea,
right.
this is a persuasive way that we can move forward as a world community that is intersecting. I think it comes to mind like what happened, you know, even foot binding.
Right.
You know, like that. You know, that was something very common practice,
right.
basically erased within a generation.
Right.
And at some point, I'm sure there was a question of cultural imperialism involved. But then, essentially, the only reason there was any way that that was an effective approach was because people just basically realized, oh, this is a good idea.
Right.
And we agree with that as a culture. But you know, it's not like I think it's a tricky way to how do you impose your ideas, and how do we accept other ideas? I mean, you know, I think there is an essential sort of imperialism that you know, I kind of think of human rights. I'm like, great, let's give them human rights. Yeah. But then you look at our own country.
Sure.
With our, you know, with the history of torture that we've acknowledged recently,
yes.
all of these, with our own like incredible drive to use the death penalty even when it's been, you know, recognized to have racist implications in our country. You know, I think that these are questions like human rights is not just for the folks out there.
Absolutely.
You know, below the equator somehow. This is, I mean, I wonder when we think about this, I think it's very tempting to look outside.
Sure.
And much easier. But when we look at even within women's rights, like how do, I mean, can you give a brief assessment of how you think this plays out in our own context, in American context? Like the competing claims of human rights and religious rights?
Well, you know what? I think the pressing example in the United States right now has to do with people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered. I think it's the queer community. You know, we can talk about religion X sees everybody as spiritually equal, but women and men actually in practice are not equal, or believers or non-believers, or you know, Brahmins and Dalits, that kind of thing. But to bring it to the United States and to talk about our majority religion, We're going to talk about Christianity, and we are going to talk about people who, for religious reasons, would like to see an amendment to the Constitution banning gay marriage. And they are very clear that this is an ethical and cultural, historical argument coming out of the United States. This is not the kind of thing we do. And it's also about the bedrock of being Christian and a Christian nation, but also as Christian people, they want to influence lawmaking. They're not wrong. I think we all vote and then have activism out of our values, religious or not. That isn't the problem. But I know someone who was a teacher in the Chicago public schools for decades and lost his job teaching math to high school kids because he is gay. There are the question of marriage. Is marriage a human right? It says so in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to marry and found a family. And in 1948, I'm going to guess, they were assuming a man and a woman.
Right.
Well, that's not the question in the United States right now. That's not the pressing question. P.S. We've already gone through anti-miscegenation kinds of restrictions on marriage. Now we're coming to gender and sexual orientation and identification.
And so what's your recommendation? I mean, I say, to put you on the spot.
Sure.
How does this interest in human rights, the value of human rights, pertain to the United States? And how do we bring that into the conversation?
I'm going to say the same thing about this situation in the United States as I do as I conclude my book, talking about any situation in any religious tradition. When it comes to differences between human rights and religious practices, so claims and conflict, people in different disciplines say, well, we need stronger laws, we need this, we need that. I think that theological positions need to change, and we know they can. Look at how they've changed in Christianity regarding women, not perfect, but regarding women, the end of human chattel slavery, and we know that many slaveholders held the Bible aloft through their defense of slavery. We are continuing to evolve, not just as a human rights concept, but certainly as nations in our ethical understandings of what is appropriate. In a situation where, let's say, female genital cutting is going on and some people perpetuate it on theological grounds, I think it's not going away until people within that community, with the helpful support of people without, but people within those communities do the theological change and make it accessible to all about why this is religiously inappropriate, or many will say this was never really a religious idea at all. This was a cultural holdover that we made religious. What do we do in the United States, those of us who are Christian, and perhaps Jewish, Muslim, or other religions too who might have a problem with this, to look at core theological concepts and do good, integrity-filled theological work to bring us more into keeping with a human rights norm. Now, not every human rights norm, I'm saying, is absolutely right, and there are real different gradations. Some human rights documents say that there is a human right to paid vacation. I love my paid vacation, but is that a basic human right? Is keeping your job, regardless of your sexual orientation, a human right? I would place that a whole lot higher. The right to life.
So so essentially, it's something that has to come from within the community, with support, but it really is an evolution, and I think that you have your work cut out for you. All right, get on it.
Okay.
I want to thank you so much, Allison, for being with us here today on the Inner Core. I want to one more time remind you about this book. It's called Women Rights and Religious Practice, Claims in Conflict. It's essentially about one of the most immediate and important evolutions over the next century, I think, is how we look towards each individual as having dignity, as respecting one another with dignity, loving one another, and how we can get there while appreciating the deep and respecting the deep religious and cultural traditions that often work at originally perceived counter perspectives, but how we can bring those together to recognize and appreciate one another. And so that is the essential message of this program, The Inner Core, increasing understanding and appreciating divergent viewpoints, I'm so glad you joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next Inner Core. Take care.